Thank you for your kind remarks. A little hyperbole at this, even if unwarranted, at this time of the morning, which for me is a godless hour, warms the cockles of one's heart, you know. Very encouraging. Now, I better explain an enigmatic title. I'm not quite sure what I had in mind, but I'll try and reveal it to you. You're looking at something quite exceptional. There are only 3 in the world, 1 in the Vatican Library, 1 in the British Museum. Alas, they're both too old to be read. This, Monsieur, Bibliothèque Nationale de Paris. And it was redeemed because Napoleon's savant brought back the mummies, and round the mummies was a packing case containing this papyrus. And if you look where the rubric is, there, it says Paul oid alopex elechinos en mega. The fox knows many things, and the hedgehog knows one big thing. Kindly bear this in mind. The year is 1953, and 2 events occurred which I wish to draw to your attention. On the 23rd of April, in the Eagle pub, which is just outside the Cavendish laboratories in Cambridge, England, a young man burst in. He was not very popular with his professor, Lawrence Bragg. He never seemed to get down to complete his PhD. And those who have not been to England, the pub is a very important place. It's where you go to drink warm beer and discuss the fate of your football team. Very important. So this fellow burst in to the Eagle pub and declared to the inmates, "I have just discovered the secret of life." They took no notice whatsoever. It was Francis Crick, and he was accompanied by a young American whom you know well. The other event of 1953 was the publication of this essay by one of my favorite philosophers, Isaiah Berlin. And it's a remarkable essay, like everything else. He was a very warm, compassionate humanist. And it's an essay on Count Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy. And the problem was to find out what sort of creative writer he was. And he began the essay with that quotation that I've just given you, Paul oid alopex. And he proposed that it's possible, semi-seriously, to divide all creative people, writers, doctors, scientists, and even friends in your laboratory, between those who are hedgehogs, who think only of one big desirable thing and everything else is subservient, a monist it's called, or you're a fox, a wily fox, with all sorts of ideas, centrifugal rather than centripetal. And you can't be tied down to one particular notion. And he amusingly divided well-known writers into those who philosophically were hedgehogs, monists, and those who, despite reading them, you never really knew what their personal philosophy was. And he came up with the conclusion that it's possible, like Tolstoy, who was the wiliest of foxes, who wanted to be a hedgehog. He tried very hard and he failed. So there is a syndrome that I'm going to call the Tolstoy syndrome, who are those who are naturally foxes, but can also create something, one thing of great value. It's even crept into nature. Hedgehog is one of the factors in genomics, as you know. So my topic is going to remind you of three people who fall into the syndrome I call the Tolstoy syndrome. The first is Stanley Fahn. The second is David Marsden, because I happen to have been present at the birth of MDS, and it happened like this. 1958, Stanley, we were in a bar, and I was listening to these wily foxes, all their contributions to movement disorders, and trying to pay my respects. When quite casually, Stanley said to me, David and I are thinking of forming a movement disorder society. What do you think? And I was foolish enough to think he wanted my opinion. So I said, it's a good idea. Right, said the hedgehog. I want you to draft the rules and regulations of this society. Right, said the other hedgehog and wily fox. David said, it's your turn to get the drinks. So as I got up to go to the bar, realizing how I'd been conned by these two men, I thought, well, I couldn't be the parent. I might be present at the birth, but I could surely be the first wet nurse of the infant. And that's how it turned out. And this infant has grown into this wonderful organization. And I'd like to stop at this point. Stanley, will you kindly stand up for us? I thought I saw you sitting there. Ladies and gentlemen, if it hadn't been for this fellow, thank you very much. We might not be sharing one another's company. Now, the second bit is my third Tolstoy syndrome. By best known, I mean not simply by neurologists and psychiatrists and doctors. I mean by the man in the street, the media and the television. Now, I've pleaded my case before, which is purely anecdotal, but I'll try and persuade you. You'll see that there's a lot to choose from. 1820 was the best, earliest reference I could find in the English language of the use of the word neurologist. But, as you will see, fame is transient. Whenever a pope is inaugurated, his first task is to walk across 3 piles of ashes and to repeat this, 6 transit gloria. By way of nothing at all, Groucho Marx translated this as Gloria is sick when she travels. But let's keep on. So we have to have someone whose fame is endured. Now here we are in Argentina, and if you look at the bottom, it's 1817. And in your imagination, I want to take you across the Atlantic to my city, and there's the map of London. Those who've been there see the sinuous Thames. You can see, yes, you can see the place where we used to put our political prisoners in when they were naughty. And if they were very naughty, we would cut their heads off. It's to be recommended. And up in the northeast portion, the circular bit, is number 1 Hoxton Square, where my nominee lived, and the smaller circle is where I was brought up. So we were neighbors, and we went to the same hospital. I stress, despite my appearance, not at the same time. there was a gap of over 100 years between his death and my birth. But I've always felt an affinity for this man, and he is, of course, James Parkinson. Now, he was a prolific writer, so he deserves the title of a fox. And there are some of his political publications, very dangerous territory. Sedition was a terrible crime, of which he was almost culpable. And in England at that time, the least punishment you could have was a one-way non-business class travel to Australia. He narrowly escaped. He also wrote extensively on many topics. Very curious man, very energetic man, required little sleep. And you see the penultimate one tucked between a letter to the editor on hydrophobia and management of fevers. All of this he brushed off. The only fame he actually achieved in his lifetime was that he was one of the pioneers of geology. At that time it was called oryctology. Oryctus is Greek for that which is dug from the ground. And it soon split into geology, paleontology, mineralogy, and so forth. But for a few years he had a reputation. But alas, such was the progress of these sciences that by the time he died, he was unknown. He also wrote some medical things with his son. Unquestionably, a fox. He died at the age of 70, unknown. And the only reference I could find was this, that when he died, he was a very, very devout man, and he represented his local church, and they couldn't find a replacement for him. That was the only attention that was paid to him. Such that over 100 years, he was unknown. And then a resurrection occurred, not in his own country, but in France. And Chris Gertz, who's a scholarly historian, has explained to you how Charcot, with difficulty, obtained a copy of this essay. It was never reprinted, it was modestly reviewed, and unknown. So the evidence of his fame, his global fame, I will briefly tell you. We're in the Eternal City, in the largest, most populous country in the world. And I was in the company of Professor Wang Xing-Day, who at that time was leader of the team who was looking after Chairman Mao's Parkinson's disease. And, you know, it's the longest continuous civilization and great discoveries. So I said to him, surely your physicians recognize Parkinson? Oh, yes, he said, yes. I said, in which case you must have a character. Yes, he said. I was very impressed. I said, now tell me, because I'm a bit of a sinophile, how is this pronounced in Mandarin? And he leaned forward and said, in Mandarin, we pronounce this Parkinson's disease. We're in the second most populous country, India. We're looking down on the holy river, the Ganges, and this is from the Maharaja's palace. And down to the side of the river is a Hindu university containing all the Sanskrit incunabula. And there you will see, it's about 4,000 years that they recognized the shaking palsy, and they had traditional drugs containing levodopa. Now in India, there are at least 39 separate languages and innumerable, immiscible, different dialects. But I'm assured by my Indian colleagues that wherever you go, the man in the street calls it Parkinson's disease, in English. In Europe, in France, maladie de Parkinson. In Germany, Parkinson Krankheit. And on one occasion, many years ago, I was a very junior member of the committee of the World Federation of Neurology, and we were charged to rewrite the description of the clinical manifestations of disorders of the basal ganglia. And the chairman was Russian. And he labored under very considerable disability because the cult of the commissars meant that eponyms were out. It all had to be union, all had to be collective activity. So we walked through most of the things, tremor and so on. But when we came to Parkinson's disease, we really had trouble. Because every member of this 30-odd committee wanted to add another subjunctive condition. And we were getting wearier and wearier. And each time we had another vodka, at last, in the early hours of the morning, the chairman said, "Comrades, it's getting late. Let's have a final vodka, call it Parkinson's disease, and we'll go to bed," which we did. Now, the question that I want to put to you is, supposing we received a letter from a neurological nirvana from James, and he was anxious to know what we have done, what we have achieved in this brave new world. Well, we would say the essay is universally admired for its brevity, originality, succinctness. And when you think it's based upon 6 patients, of whom he only spoke in detail with 1, and 3 he observed at a distance, he had what we badly need today. He had what every clinician, and now I would suggest to you every genomic specialist, the ability to see the wood from the trees. It's original, it's modest, and it's full of useful information. For example, in the one patient that he saw from whom he took a detailed history, he used shorthand, by the way, that's why he was such a good clinician. He got this remote history of the effect of an additional trauma on static tremor, and he wrote it down. That would never appear in one of our scoring systems, incidentally. On page 7, he talks about sleep disturbances, which are so fashionable. He talks about effect on the bowel, which is so fashionable. And we are now beginning to realize, here is one well-known paper. There's another very good one by Eldad and his colleagues from Petah Tikva in Israel on the diverse, dispersed manifestations of what we still call Parkinson's disease. And Bill Langston stresses not only the diversity, but the duration, probable duration. And I was fascinated to hear, and I hope this is here, Paula Parkkinen, who wrote 2 very good papers from Finland, from their very extensive brain bank, in which, if the patient, they're normal people without presence of evident disease, in the group who are 40 plus, 2 or 3% of them stain positively for alpha-synuclein. I wonder if there's anyone able to do it at the age of 30 or 20, because James would want to know when the disease began, and we don't know. In the so-called genetical ones, it probably begins in utero. And James said, because in those days it was just venesection, what hope can there be for effective treatment? And we would reply, you were right. It was drug-induced Parkinsonism and the evolution of dopamine deficiency. This is the famous paper from Austria by Hornikewitz, when he demonstrated for the first time that in brains of those with Parkinson's disease there was a focal deficiency. The rest you know, the miracle of the levodopa era. Highly improbable, but wonderful. And then James would say, because he stressed the need for pathology, and he urged his more senior colleagues to look. He predicted that the disease might begin in the upper medulla, so he and Brock could have gone to bed together. And we would say, well, these beautiful slides from my colleague Tamas Revets at the National, the well-known depletion of dopamine containing Nigel cells, they're well known to you, Lewy bodies and alpha-synuclein. But James was a very shrewd man, and he would posit, well, if it's been going on for so long, surely these are nothing but tombstones. That is James' tombstone. What do we know? And we would say, well, in the past decades we've amassed an enormous amount of information. Look at this list, so well known to you, either on the dopamine. And whenever I see this list now, I'm reminded of that beautiful film, Casablanca. You remember the chief of police, Captain Renaud? And whenever a crime has been committed, he always said the same thing. Round up the usual suspects. That's what they are. And they afflict at the most about 30% of patients. So the proposal might be they are no more than interesting tombstones. So where does the poor old clinician stand in all this? You remember, before the genomic revolution, we have the 3 S's, seed, soil, and senility. The genetics, environmental factors, and aging. And then we have this deluge, which is going to get far, far worse. How do we keep steady? I'm lucky I have access to some first-class clinical colleagues. One of them is sitting in front of me, Andrew Lees, Neil Quinn, Kainish Bhatia, who can keep my faltering hand steady. But I also have access to some fine scientists. And I warmly recommend to you Steve Jones, who writes beautifully and clearly. He's a biologist. He defined molecular biology as comparative anatomy, writ very small, but with a very large research grant, which is just what it is, comparative anatomy. And here are some of his conclusions. Run your eye down the list. It's full of facts, and those of you who went to Tom Gasser and his colleagues' excellent session, that lucid presentation of what we know, will not need to have that repeated, except to emphasize its complexity. I like item 6, that a tiny weed has more genes than a Nobel Prize laureate. And the bottom one is something that I think needs emphasizing, because we have been fooled. We've been fooled by the pioneers of genomics and of the genomic theory, and from Cambridge, because they had a sort of Platonic notion about the direct line between genes and clinical manifestations. It was a parody of the truth. I remember hearing Sidney Brenner, who was a member of the team, who got the Nobel Prize too. And he began a lecture by saying, it's really easy, you know, DNA makes RNA, RNA makes protein, and protein makes money, he said. Nothing could be further from the truth. Because what we are learning painfully, that it's not a direct line. It's not the fashionable word, a cascade. A cascade is a small waterfall. Its behavior is predictable. It obeys only one law, gravity. It's always in one predictable direction. Nothing could be further from the truth about genomics. It is a four-dimensional labyrinth. And the biggest, the most difficult component is the fourth dimension of time. What controls it? What turns it on? What turns it off? Because I have to remind myself that one of the most impressive articles I ever read was in 1930. It was in German, so it didn't reach many in North America, but it was by a celebrated pathologist called Otto Vogt. And he was very interested in why selective vulnerability, why certain cells win. If he'd known about frontotemporal dementia, he would say, well, that's very interesting, but what about the other cells? Why are they not affected? And he didn't have the tools. If you want to read it, Der Begriff their pathoclise, the concept of pathoclisis. What does it mean? This is the problem facing us. So the system is exceedingly complicated. And one of the interesting things to know is how subtle it all is, and how sensitive DNA is. It can react very easily to environmental changes. And although we now have lists of posited environmental factors, there must be many, many more. So we have a problem. We have a conceptual problem. The disease, according to the analysts, has become the emergent properties of molecular networks, not network, networks, as opposed to a core biological process driven by some of those suspects I mentioned to you. And here I have Professor Nicholas Wood's permission, who's another active member of this society, of course, and he questions some of the unsolved problems. A single molecular mutation present in every cell, and yet only some undergo degeneration. He's still using this word, which I object to, I'm afraid, of cascade. I think he makes it sound easier than it is. And he concludes that there might be a final common pathway. Why should there be a final common pathway? Parkinson's disease affects at most 2% of the population. What about the 98%? Why do they not get it? Now, we're going to be flooded with information. You heard yesterday the first stab at the human genome cost $2.3 billion at the moment, and it took weeks and months and years. At the moment, it costs about $20,000, and it's predicted to come down fast. But the other thing is the speed of analysis. It can be done in about half an hour, and it's going to get faster, because the technology behind it is so sophisticated and so fast, and it's getting cheaper. That means a further avalanche of inscrutable data that the clinicians have got to try and sort out for the scientists in that direction. I'll give you two examples of neurology, if I may, from outside movement disorders. Every clinician knows that the prognosis for grade 4 glioma is hopeless. Weeks and months. Doesn't matter what treatment you have. And every now and then, having given great news to the family, 2 or 3% survive for years. That 2 or 3% cannot, for financial reasons, interest the pharmaceutical industry. But some clever men at NIH are beginning to study those who have responded. And there's a possibility that there's a mutated enzyme which is now recognizable, which might be amenable to treatment. But I don't want it to sound easy, because if I may give you my final example, about a month ago in Nature, there's a most interesting article of a study of a pair of twins, monozygotic twins, one of whom had advanced, unequivocal multiple sclerosis, the other was not. MS is considered to be some sort of autoimmune disease. So they, at considerable expense, they studied in great detail every item of their genome. And there was no difference between the two. So the implication is that there are a number of factors, environmental perhaps, but the complexity which has liberated a destructive system in one patient and not in her twin. So it's going to be, I apologize for that awful, disrespectful acronym. That wonderful artist should be tied up with this sort of business is a disgrace. So, dear colleagues, What do? Well, we do what we're trained to do and what we do well. Because unless we conduct ourselves as James Parkinson did, meticulous histories, it's from that source that we're going to find the clues to disentangle this avalanche, this tsunami, if I may use the word, of biological data. If you find molecular biology as difficult as I do, take comfort, because a mouse called Doogie was engineered, and they have more than 30 mutations which improve cognitive performance, so there's hope for us all. Now finally, I've been teasing you and teasing myself a bit, but what I want to make clear, at least in my opinion, we are faced with a quantum leap, what Thomas Kuhn would call a paradigm shift. We've got to think of diseases in a different way, not only those who get it, and when they get it, and at what rate they get it, and the relationship with neuropathology, but also why the others don't. And we poor humans who can't express ourselves clearly have to turn to the poets. You remember the slide of the arch hedgehog and the arch fox. William Shakespeare was in England, our arch fox. And you recall the first act of Hamlet. Hamlet says to his companion, Horatio, "I've seen the ghost of my father." And Horatio said, "Nonsense." And Hamlet replies, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than I dreamt of in your philosophy." And as we're in a Latin country, I refer you to my fox, Dante Alighieri. And those of you who are not familiar with this, let me remind you that the poet had ascended through Inferno, through the hell, through Purgatorio, to heaven. And he's accompanied by his beautiful Beatrice. And he who wanted to see one thing clearly says to her, I'm puzzled. I've seen so many things, nothing fits in. I can't understand it. And Dante says, this is medieval Italian, so you must forgive me. Tu stesso ti fa grosso col falso immaginar, sì che non vedi ciò che vedesti se l'avessi scosso. Which roughly translated means, if you could cleanse your mind of preconceived notions, you will see the present more clearly. Now it may be that like Henry Ford, you think history, what was the word he used? Dumb, of no consequence. Well, he may have read the New Yorker. And Gross sums it all up, which is what I've been trying to do. It's very puzzling. Señoras y señores, muchísimas gracias por su amable atención.